Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to Cosmic Chemistry, to Science and God Mix. My name is Glenn Honberg. I direct the City Bible Forum in Brisbane, the host of tonight's event. The City Bible Forum is a national organisation working in most of the capital cities around Australia. We haven't quite got to Darwin or Hobart yet, poor them. We try to ask the bigger questions right in the heart of the cities with city workers. Now, the shape of tonight really is about engaging on this issue, the science and God mix. The way you can be part of that conversation is up on the screens. You will see both the hashtag CosChem or an SMS number, and they will go through to our moderator, Steve Austin. Let me tell you a little bit about Steve. Steve Austin got his big break in journalism, studying and working in Townsville. In his own words, he described getting into radio as the perfect occupation for someone with a big mouth and an even bigger ego. Since then, Steve Austin has worked for the 7:30 Report, and he's been the producer of Queensland's State Line Public Affairs program. He's worked in many roles for media and journalism, and he's currently the presenter of the morning program for ABC Radio 612. Steve's deeply interested in philosophy and history and contemporary Australia, but his preference would be able to enjoy all of these while risking life and limb hurling up and down the east coast of Australia on a man-eating motorcycle. We're privileged to have Steve join us tonight. Come on up to the stage, Stephen. Now, I actually met with Steve yesterday just to chat through the program tonight, and he, when he greeted me at the door, we're privileged to have him tonight, because when he greeted me at the door, he said, I'm fine, come in. And I thought, well, you might be fine, but I'm about to meet with the Godfather. I might not come out of this alive. So it's great to have you here, mate, with your sore throat. Let me tell you about Professor John Lennox. Professor John Lennox is a professor of mathematics at Oxford University. He's an internationally renowned speaker on the relationship between science, philosophy, and religion. He regularly teaches at many academic institutions, the Said Business School, Wycliffe Hall, and the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. He's also a senior fellow with the Trinity Forum. John has written a number of books on the relationship between science and Christianity, including God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God?, Gunning for God, and also The 7 Days That Divide the World. John has debated a number of prominent atheistic thinkers, Richard Dawkins, the late great Christopher Hitchens, and Lawrence Krauss. John speaks Russian, French, German, Spanish, and English with a lovely Irish lilt. I think he'll be using English. One of my friends described him as they heard him speak, as your favourite Irish grandfather that you never had but wish that you did, even if you're not Irish. John enjoys gazing at the stars and birds as an amateur astronomer and birdwatcher. He's married to Sally with 3 adult children and 5 grandchildren. Please welcome Dr. John Lennox to the stage.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honour for me to be here tonight, but I must, in the interest of truth, make a correction. I have 7 grandchildren. I have immensely enjoyed the recent days travelling around your wonderful country. I started in Sydney and then went down to Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, from where I came yesterday to Brisbane, and I'm here for the first time. And I would like to thank you for the warmth of your welcome. The City Bible Forum in each of these cities has put on a magnificent effort. And like tonight, everywhere we've been, there's been an absolutely packed audience. And I'm particularly honoured tonight at having a very distinguished journalist be the moderator and interviewer. I myself have been involved in a bit of journalism in Russia, and so I've come to admire the art of the journalist. And I'm looking forward much more to discussing with Steve than I am to giving this talk right now. But talk I must, and the question before us tonight is, do science and God mix? I shall be suggesting what for some of you may perhaps be slightly revolutionary, that science and God for many people appear to not mix, and atheism and God appear to be the best mix. I want to suggest that atheism and science don't mix, but science and God do. So let's have a look at it. Let's get rid of the popular misapprehension that our society is engaged in a kind of warfare between science and God, and science has won it, and it's just that people haven't woken up to it. That cannot be true. For the very simple reason that if you go to the top level of science, say physics, the Nobel Prize, last year it was won by Peter Higgs, a Scotsman who's an atheist. A few years before that, it was won by Bill Phillips, an American, who's a Christian. And it's perfectly clear that what divides these men is not their science. They both won the Nobel Prize. What divides them is their worldview. One is a theist, a Christian, and the other is an atheist. And I want to suggest that there is a real conflict. There's a real debate. But it's not really a debate between God and science. It's a debate between the two diametrically opposed worldviews of naturalism and theism. Naturalism that says that nature is all there is, the universe or the multiverse is all that exists, mass, energy are the determinators of everything. And the worldview that said, no, there's more than that. There is transcendence. There is a creator who created and sustains the universe. Those are the worldviews in conflict, and there are equally distinguished scientists on both sides. So really, the question that's before us is, which way does science point? Does it point towards atheism, or does it point towards God, or does it not point anywhere? And being a mathematician, I need to explain that I want to draw on evidence, not proof. At least not proof in the mathematical sense. Because I have the luxury of working in a field where you can talk about rigorous proof, but it's the only field in which you can do so. In the natural sciences and in ordinary life, we cannot talk about proof in the mathematical sense of deducing true theorems from the assumption of certain axioms and agreed principles of logic. In every other field, it's a question of inference to the best explanation, pointers, evidence, and so on. For instance, I cannot prove to you mathematically that my wife of 46 years loves me. I'd stake my life on it. The point I'm making is, just because we cannot give a mathematical proof, it doesn't mean that we can't have evidence sufficient to stake a great deal on it, including our life. I could not mathematically prove to you that the aircraft that's going to take me on Tuesday from Sydney to Vancouver will get me there. I couldn't prove it. But yet I'm prepared to stake my life on it. So life is like that. So please don't think I'm going to give you mathematical proofs. But secondly, please don't think that I believe that therefore the evidence I'm about to adduce is weak in some way. It's just that it's different. It is measured to the subject under question. And the first line of evidence is history. Because you see, we have a very interesting situation, a puzzling situation, really. Stephen Hawking is arguably the world's best-known living scientist. He believes that we must choose between God and science. You cannot be intellectually respectable and believe in God. He held, until recently, Isaac Newton's chair at Cambridge. But Isaac Newton did believe in God. So what has happened between the 16th century and the 21st century? How is it that Isaac Newton believed in God and Stephen Hawking doesn't? Now, the interesting thing about that is that historians and philosophers of science, and you have a very distinguished one here at the University of Queensland, Professor Peter Harrison, have investigated this question because it's obvious as a fact of history that Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, and many other distinguished pioneer scientists all were believers in God. And naturally, people ask, is there a connection, or is this just an accident of history? And the general view, with various nuances, is that there is a very deep connection. C.S. Lewis, who I used to listen to many years ago in Cambridge, wrote this: men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. That's fascinating to me, because it means that belief in God, far from hindering science, was the motor that drove it. That's quite astonishing in light of the impression you get from so many distinguished people today that belief in God will hinder your science. I'll never forget, as a 19-year-old in Cambridge, being called into the room of a Nobel Prize winner. I tried to talk to him about my faith in God at dinner, rather unsuccessfully, and he invited me in with a number of other professors, no other students. And he said to me, "Lennox, do you want a career in science?" I said, "Yes, sir." Well, he said, "The first thing you'll do is give up these naive and primitive ideas of God. They will cripple you intellectually, they'll hold you back academically, and they'll ruin your career." That was pressure, and I felt it. And I said, "Sir, what have you to offer me that's better than what I've already got?" Well, it was some kind of Bergsonian evolutionism, which I suspect nobody here knows about very much. And I said, "I think I'll take the risk of sticking with what I've got." But his impression, you see, was that belief in God was a hindrance. And yet with this huge tradition of the top scientists in the time of the 16th, 17th centuries, all that tends to get airbrushed out. But let me state it very clearly. I'm not remotely embarrassed at being both a Christian and a scientist, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. Now, what has happened between then and now? And I want to try and explain that. And I'd like to suggest to you that what has happened is a great deal of fog has been generated. And concepts have been subtly altered in their meanings so that the general public is not aware really of what is going on. Hawking says you've got to choose between science and God. Well, mercifully, statements of scientists are not necessarily statements of science. That, I think, is one of the first things we need to learn in this debate. And of course, one of the difficulties for many of our students is the immense authority, quite rightly, which science has got through its spin-offs in technology, so that when scientists pronounce, people tend to take it seriously because they give the statement of a scientist the kind of authority they would give to science. So, for example, Stephen Hawking was interviewed some time ago by the London Times, I think. What did he think of religion? And his answer was, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. Now, that's a statement of a scientist. It's not a statement of science. I was asked to reply, so I did in like manner. I said, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Well, don't clap, ladies and gentlemen, because I pointed out a statement by a scientist is not necessarily a statement of science. But the point is, what we're doing there is showing you that the Freudian argument is a two-edged sword and proves nothing. It is very common, especially in attacks on people like me, to say, well, of course you believe in God. You're mentally weak. You need a crutch as some sort of wish fulfillment father in the sky. But Manfred Lutz, a very distinguished German psychiatrist, in a brilliant book called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, that is a brief history of the great one, published recently, he said, if there is no God, of course Freud gives you a brilliant argument why belief in God is a wish fulfillment, a projection, all this, if there is no God. Of course, he said, if there is a God, the very same argument shows you that atheism is a projection of the idea never to have to give account to God, never to have to deal with God for the mess up I've made in my life. But on the question whether there's a God or not, neither Freud, Jung, or Frankl can help you at all. You'll have to look elsewhere. And the point I'm making is many of these arguments that seem superficially extremely powerful can be reversed, and they apply equally well to atheism. So we need to go elsewhere. The next thing is to note the confusion about the nature of God. That may seem strange to you, But you see, there is a habit these days of relegating the God of the Bible to belong to a kind of Greek pantheon, like the Greek god of thunder or lightning who disappears on doing a bit of science. I mean, we don't believe in the Greek god of lightning because we can, a very brief course in atmospheric physics will clear the matter of lightning up very well indeed. Now, the essential property of such a Greek god is that he or she is a god of the gaps. That is a god that disappears as science advances. We don't know what electricity is. We postulate a god. We find out what electricity is. That god disappears. And because of this, the ubiquity of this kind of conceptualization in the ancient world, many people today think that that's what I believe. That is, that God for me is simply an unknown X that holds the fort until science advances and closes the gap. Let me assure you, I do not believe in such a God of the gaps. I believe in a God who's God of the whole show, who created the entire cosmos and upholds it, created the bits I do understand and the bits I don't understand, created everything. Now, this is very important because you see, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at it logically. If you think of God as a God of the gaps, then you've got to choose between God and science, simply because that's the way you've defined God. It's nothing to do with science. You simply define God to be that which disappears on the advance of science. So you've got to choose. But it's a false alternative. And you can see that easily with Newton, you see, when he discovered his law of gravitation. He didn't say, wonderful, I've got a law of gravitation, I don't need God. No, he said, what a wonderful God that does it that way. And he wrote the Principia Mathematica, the most famous book in the history of science, expressing explicitly the hope that it would lead thinking people to believe in a deity. Come forward the years to Hawking, and Hawking says, because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing, so we don't need God. When I first read that, I was stunned by its multiple self-contradictions. Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. That's a flat contradiction. Worse still, the universe can create itself. Well, if I say to you X creates Y, I mean that assuming X, you'll get Y. If I say X creates X, it means assuming X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? It means that nonsense remains nonsense, even if high-powered scientists are writing it. I find this staggering, that such elementary logical mistakes could be made by a world-famous scientist trying to get rid of the idea of God. He's got rid of no such thing. You see, he's making a mistake, a very simple philosophical category mistake that Newton didn't make. He's confusing law and mechanism on the one hand with agency on the other. You see, Newton admired the God who did it that way. Because he had a law, that was reason for admiring God more, not for admiring him less. And that's true, of course. The more you know about engineering, the more you could admire the genius of a Rose or a Royce. The more you know about painting, the more you could admire the genius of a Picasso, not the less. So the more we know about the universe, the more we can admire the genius of the God that did it that way, because we are not, peace be to Richard Dawkins, thinking of God as the same kind of explanation as science. God no more conflicts or competes as an explanation with science as Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car. None of us would dream of saying that because we got the law of internal combustion, we have to stop believing in Henry Ford. But that's exactly the argument that's been put across to you. It's exactly that argument. Because we understand how a motor car works, we don't need to believe in Henry Ford. It's a nonsense argument. And it's childish, actually, because it commits grave philosophical mistakes. Let me illustrate it again, because it's so important. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, because the heat from the Bunsen flame is warming up the copper, and it's being transmitted through the copper to the molecules of water, and they're getting very agitated, as things do when they get heated. And that's spouting off steam and so on and so forth. That's why it's boiling. No, it isn't. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. That's why it's boiling. Well, to put those two explanations in competition with one another is naive beyond belief. We are used in every area of life to multi-leveled explanation. Why is it in the one area when it comes to God, we change course and say there can only be one kind of explanation? There's something curious going on there. It's not God or science. It's cosmic chemistry. God and science mix beautifully. Historically, belief in God was the motivation that led people to stop science. No, to start it. And it continues to be the same for many of us. So the trouble is, ladies and gentlemen, if I just step back from what I've said to you, it's to do with the nature of explanation. We are constantly told science explains. But what does that mean? Newton and his law of gravitation is a good example. What do you think the law of gravitation explains? The one thing it doesn't explain is what gravity is. I hope they taught you that at school, or at least at university. Nobody knows what gravity is, even today. You say, well, what use is the law of gravitation? Enormous use. You can put a person on the moon simply by using Newton's equation with its 8 symbols, a wonderful example of mathematical compressibility. But what that law doesn't tell you is what gravity is. You see, when we hear the word science explains, we get bamboozled into thinking that it gives us a full-orbed explanation at every level. It almost never does, and certainly not in terms of its laws. And the brilliant philosopher Wittgenstein pointed this out when he said, the greatest deception of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature. They are not. All they do is describe structural regularities, which is enormously important. So even at its own level, science doesn't do the whole job of explaining. So all I'm pleading for is a realistic assessment of the nature of explanation, and not shutting down to saying, as many of my colleagues do, that science is the only way to truth. That cannot be true, even logically. It was Bertrand Russell that said, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. That is an expression of what is now called scientism. Science is the only way to truth. But you see, the statement, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know, is not a statement of science. So you cannot know it. So if it's true, it's false. Have you got that? I mean, it's pretty late for logic, but we'll try anyway. It's incoherent. And Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize, was far wiser when he said, it's so easy to see that science is limited. It cannot answer the simple questions of a child. What are we here for? What is the meaning of life? And where do I come from? I'm passionate about science, ladies and gentlemen. But there echoes in my head that advice of Peter Medawar in his book, Advice to Young Scientists. We do science a very big disservice if we give the public the impression it can answer all questions. Einstein had the wisdom to see that you may well talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. So what am I suggesting? I'm suggesting that historically there's a powerful precedent for linking belief in the rational intelligibility of the universe and God. Secondly, I'm suggesting that the reason that there's been a polar shift in understanding has got to do, firstly, with a loss of the concept of the God of the Bible as distinct from the gods of the ancient Greeks, and secondly, confusion as to what constitutes scientific explanation. Now, one of the very interesting things that Albert Einstein said, amongst many, many things, that has always been of fascination to me was this, The only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And Eugen Wigner, Nobel Prize winner, wrote in 1961 a famous paper beloved by mathematicians, which he called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. How is it that a mathematician, she's thinking in here, she comes up with equations that appear to describe something out there? How does that actually work? That these abstract symbols and relationship between them can somehow reflect relationships which we believe to be real and out there. How does that work? And he says it's totally unreasonable. I want to argue it is unreasonable if you're an atheist, but it's perfectly reasonable if you are a believer in God. Now, why is that? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to come to my major reason for being very skeptical about atheism. And I'm going to try to demonstrate to you some cosmic chemistry that atheism and science do not mix. God and science do. It all goes back, in a way, to Darwin's doubt, as it has come to be known. I'll read it. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. You can see the argument. You see, we live in a world that claims often that explanation, if it's to be worthwhile, must go from the bottom to the top. And since the universe essentially is all derived from mass energy with the laws of nature wherever they came from, real explanation reduces everything to physics and chemistry. And so Francis Crick came out in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. You, your joys and sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Well, if that's true, ladies and gentlemen, as my professor of quantum physics at Cambridge, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, points out, we wouldn't know it. Because if Crick's thesis, and I'm quoting Polkinghorne, is true, it destroys rationality. Thought is replaced by electrochemical neural events. The world of rational discourse dissolves into the absurd chattering of firing synapses. Quite frankly, that cannot be right, and none of us believes it to be so. Now, the argument here is simply this. If you have a reductionist explanation, it dissolves rationality. That is, it dissolves the explanation itself into meaninglessness. And leading philosophers in the world now are picking this up, and not simply Christian philosophers, but also atheist philosophers. Let's take a Christian philosopher first. Alvin Plantinga of Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes. Then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. Now listen to this. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. And there's been an explosive reaction to a book by Thomas Nagel, one of America's current leading philosophers, because the book title, well, listen to it, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. A book written by an atheist has caused a nuclear explosion in the intellectual world. And listen to what he says. If the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. So where does that leave us? Where it leads us, ladies and gentlemen, is the serious omission that's being corrected now, but far too late. We've thought about the natural world, but we haven't thought about thinking. And you see, every scientist like me has got to, as an article of faith, before we do any science at all, believe that the universe is accessible, that it's rationally intelligible, that science can be done. If you don't believe that, you won't do any science. But why should you believe it? You see, I often talk to my colleagues and I say, what is it you do science with? And they say their brain, because they think the mind is the brain. Say, okay, and what's the brain? Well, to cut a long story short, if you want the long story, we can give it. The short story is, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I say, and you trust it? If you knew that your iMac was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't trust it for a second. You see, here's the fascinating thing. Reject God, and you're beginning to lose an explanation for the rationality you need to use to reject God. In other words, let me put it this way, that naturalism doesn't simply shoot itself in the foot. That can be painful. It shoots itself in the brain, and that's fatal. So let me end with a little story that will illustrate this. We have wonderful dinners in our college, and one of the snags is that we can't always choose our neighbours. We usually can't whom we're sitting with. And I was sitting with a very famous biochemist, and he was very upset when he heard I was a mathematician because he said, that's boring. And then I made it worse by saying inadvertently, well, I tried to make up for that by being interested in big questions like the status of the universe, is it created or not? No, he said, that's even worse. I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've nothing to talk about, we're going to have a miserable evening. So that's a bit of a challenge at dinner. So I said, no, I think we've got lots to talk about. I'm actually a reductionist too. He said, what do you mean? Well, I said, split a big problem into little problems, study the little problems, get insight for the big problem. Oh, he said, I do that. Well, I said, so do I. But he said, I don't mean that. I said, I know you don't mean that. You're an ontological reductionist. Everything reduces to physics and chemistry. He said, that's right. So I said, let's do an experiment then. He said, what, here at dinner? I said, yes, this is Oxford. So he said, what's the experiment? So I picked up the menu, and on it said roast chicken. He said, what's the problem? I said, none from my perspective, but a big problem from yours. He said, how? Well, I said, look at this, roast, R-O-A-S-T. He said, yes, it means roast chicken. I said, how do you know? I said, these are just marks on paper. Oh, but they mean roast. I said, very good. Here's the question for you. You explain to me how they mean roast in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And there was a short silence. And his wife said, get out of that if you can. But he didn't try. He stunned me with his answer. He said, you know, John, he was getting friendly now. He said, I have believed it could be done for 40 years, every day going into my lab. And it so obviously can't. You need an intelligence to explain ROASD. It's not within the explanatory power of physics and chemistry to account for the semiotics, the way those marks carry meaning. And it's not an intelligence of the gaps, ladies and gentlemen. Intelligent input is the only explanation we know makes sense of anything that involves language. Have you noticed that? The moment you see City Bible Forum, you know instinctively that that cannot exhaustively be explained in terms of unguided naturalistic processes because it's got language on it. And more than that, you postulate a human intelligence behind that that's infinitely more complex than what you're looking at. Richard Dawkins' idea that God isn't an explanation of anything because he's more complex than the thing you're explaining is sheer nonsense. He's the explanation for his book, and he's much more complicated than his book, at least I think he is. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, here's the twist. That biochemist studies DNA. It's a word as well. It's got 3.5 billion, roughly, codons. They code for something, for the proteins. It's got a semiotic dimension. And what about that then? You look at 5 letters, R-O-A-S-T, you say intelligence, whatever other processes are involved. And you look at 3.5 billion letters of DNA and you say, chance and the laws of nature. Really? Is that all there is to it? It flies against every experience, every understanding that we have had. And this isn't a God of the gaps explanation. It's the nature of the problem that points upwards to intelligence. And for that reason, ladies and gentlemen, When I take these two worldviews, the worldview that starts with in the beginning was mass energy, and mind is derivative. And the other worldview that starts in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to exist through him. It's not only as a Christian, but as a scientist, that I infinitely prefer the second to the first. Thank you very much indeed.
So, I'd like to remind you that there is a Twitter handle. Don't laugh at my voice. There's a Twitter handle and an SMS number. And if you have a question you'd like me to put through to John, I will ask it of him. But I want to pick you up on the genetic code one first up, John. We can reduce it down to 4 letters, AGCT, all standing for the 4 base chemicals in the human DNA. Now, Dawkins and you reach entirely opposite viewpoints about the origins of this, yet you can both do science. He's an unbeliever, you're a believer. Doesn't his argument stand that you don't need God to explain things? He does science. He's a very respected biologist. He's got a very eminent book on the human eye. He can explain the DNA as well, but he doesn't need God to explain that because he has evidence and facts, and he can reduce those 4 using those 4 letters, AGCT.
Well, I contest your assertion, because you see, Dawkins cannot explain DNA, and he admits it. A long time ago, when he wrote The Blind Watchmaker, he talked about the Darwinian process of mutation and natural selection being the explanation for the existence and the variation of life. He's given up the first part now because nobody knows how life came to be. So I would contest that he doesn't know how DNA came to be. Now, in The Blind Watchmaker, he tried to create a simulation that would reduce the probabilities or the improbabilities that he admits stand in the way of any naturalistic origin of life. And he did his famous tapping monkeys, typing monkeys thing. I have analysed that. And
eventually they'll write Hamlet if they give it enough
yes,
time.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. That's right. They'll come up with it. But the irony of his solution was he had a head monkey watching the whole process. So he says there's a target sequence, and the one he uses comes from Hamlet. Me thinks it's like a weasel. When Hamlet was looking up at the clouds, it looks like a weasel. So Dawkins has this as a target sequence, and he's 34 typing monkeys, you see. But the variation he gives, in order to give it some chance of producing the target sequence, is when, say, the first monkey's rapping away, and suddenly the first monkey hits an M, and the head monkey says, "Stop there." And so he captures it. And of course, you get to the end of the sequence very rapidly. But Dawkins' analogy is proving the exact opposite of what he asserts, because he's got an intelligently designed mechanism to increase the probabilities. Well, that intelligence could well be God, if you see what I mean. In other words, all of his arguments, and I've analysed them in my book, God's Undertaker, in some detail. They don't use them very much these days, I notice. But all of the arguments point to me towards intelligent input. So my response to you there, Steve, is that Dawkins actually hasn't. We know from the point of view of materialistic science, the problem of the origin of genetic information is more and more difficult, because the theoretical computing people are coming in very heavily and posing immense challenges to the biologists. Because you see, a cell, for example, and I'll finish with this, a cell is an information processor at the very least. And so according to theorems in theoretical computer science, any information processor can be simulated by an abstract automaton called a Turing machine. Now, you needn't worry what that is, but it simulates any conceivable computer, past, present, or future. And there's a central result in that area that says a Turing machine cannot create new information that goes beyond the information in its own physical system and in its input. Now, you see, if that is true, it is a deadly blow to the notion that unguided natural processes can produce any kind of information at all. So that's how I'd respond to that.
He also points out that he argues that you also are an atheist. if you look at it the right way, that you don't believe in the Hindu god Ganesh, you don't believe in Zoroaster, you don't believe in Thor, neither does he. You have something in common, a lot more in common, except he adds one more name.
Yes.
God with a capital G or Yahweh, whatever you like. His point is that you also are an atheist, that there are certain gods or deities that you don't believe in. You've simply chosen one that suits your worldview better based on philosophy or metaphysics, not on materialism, not on science, not on evidence.
Well, it's interesting you raised that. We were chatting about Peter Hitchens earlier, and I did a debate, the God Squad debate that we have every year too in Oxford in the Union, where we all dress up. And Dawkins was there, but he wasn't part of the debate. But one of his colleagues, Michael Shermer, who's editor of Skeptic magazine, used exactly that argument. And he looked at me rather fiercely and he said, "You are an atheist." With respect to Artemis, he went almost through the whole alphabet until he got to Zeus. And then he said, "We just go one God more." And I thought how utterly naive. The first reaction was, doesn't this man know anything about ancient Greeks, ancient Babylon, and the ancient gods? You see, by saying we go one God more, he's saying what I was pointing out in the beginning. The God of the Bible is exactly the same as these other gods. Now, let me make a confession so that, Steve, you know where I stand. I am an Azeusist. I am an Awotanist. And I am an Artemist and all the rest of it, an Ganeshist, and so on. But I'm not an atheist. Why? Well, I'm very interested in the ancient gods, as you may have seen. And one of the world leading brilliant minds on it is a man called, or was, Werner Jaeger at Oxford. And he says the difference is this. All of the gods of antiquity were descended from the heavens and earth. That is, they were ultimately products of the primeval chaos. The God of the Bible created the heavens and the earth. He's not even in the same category. And when that argument is used, my first reaction is your concept of God needs to be corrected. That we're not dealing with one in the list. We're dealing with the unique God who created and sustains the heavens and the earth. And actually, Xenophanes, he's a very interesting chap, Xenophanes, because he was the one who lampooned the ancient gods. And I can't remember his wonderful thing where he said if, lions had gods, they looked like lions, and if elephants had gods, they looked like elephants. And he laughed at the Greek gods as being projections of human imagination. But then he said something spectacular. He said, but there is one God, infinite in power and wisdom, who's not like that at all, who is responsible for the whole show. So even in ancient Greece, there was a recognition by some of their thinkers of that difference. So I simply reject the argument. It sounds very subtle, but I think it's totally beside the point. The answer has got to be given in terms of the nature of God. And why, of course, I believe in a God like that is another matter. I've started to explain it, but I haven't finished explaining it.
Now, not believing in God hasn't damaged the work of Richard Dawkins or Lawrence Krauss or many of these other guys. In fact, many of the Enlightenment thinkers, they were still able to do their science. They were still able to make mighty discoveries that took human civilization forward in leaps and bounds. You implied, if not directly said before, that you think God and science are absolutely must be together, but it didn't damage them being atheists or their conclusions.
And there's a good reason for that, from where I sit. And it's a very penetrating question, actually. That interests me. I haven't heard it quite put that way before. I'd be the first to admit the brilliance of my atheist scientific colleagues. Now, the first thing we need to recognize is the vast majority of science doesn't raise these big questions at all. Dawkins in his book talks about the universe and biology being apparently designed. I believe it's actually designed, but when it comes to doing science, Steve, it makes no difference to your science whether you believe it's apparently designed or actually designed. You'll do the same science. Most of the biologists I know, and I know many of them, are studying how does this fit in here, what's the DNA of that like compared with this, and their worldview doesn't play any role whatsoever. Now, the reason I would sit on your side in this and say atheists can do brilliant science. Now, they won't accept this, but this is my explanation of why they can do it, is because every human being, whether they believe in God or not, is made in the image of God and therefore has that capacity to be creative. And so you get the swing. The first director of the Human Genome Project, Jim Watson, a brilliant scientist and an atheist. The second director, Francis Collins, a Christian. You know, I have no problem with that. But I think it doesn't answer the question whether there is a God or not. Because on the assumption there is a God, exactly what I would expect to find is atheists doing brilliant science.
You've been going around debating what are called the new atheists.
Yes.
Oh, I'm keen to know, what do you think is the best atheist argument you've heard so far? In other words, I want you to defend them. Because remember, it was John Stuart Mill argued that he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of it. His point was that you must be able to hear from people who actually believe their argument vigorously to understand what your own argument is in full context. So what's the best atheist argument against God that you've heard in your sort of debates over the last decade or so?
Well, you've pushed a very important button inadvertently, because what Mill said has been extremely important to me in life. Coming from Ireland, my parents Christian, my grandparents Christian, and so on. So I believe in God, so it's Irish genetics and so on. So what happened to me, and if you don't mind, let me explain, a little bit of my own history, because it comes directly in on this.
You're fulfilling all the Irish stereotypes. Does that mean you drink and you're a hard man and you fight hard as well?
No, I fulfilled none of them, actually, but there we are. When I got to Cambridge, the first big challenge was a student who asked me, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh goodness, I forgot you're Irish." I should never have asked you that question, because you Irish all believe in God and fight about it. Now that was a very innocuous statement I'd heard many times before, but you know, it changed my life. On that day in Cambridge, as an 18-year-old, I decided, right, I believe Christianity to be true, but I've never been able to interact seriously with atheists, agnostics, people of other religions, so I'm going to start today. And I've done it for over 50 years now, all the time, interacting with the main arguments, the leading arguments, and the leading proponents of those arguments. Why? Because I believe that Mill was right. The easiest person, to quote Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, the easiest person for me to deceive is me. So I need to investigate. And what I found is, by making my faith in God open and vulnerable, if you like, and reading the literature and taking it seriously, what I found is my faith in God has grown. Now, that's one side of it. The other side of it is, what is the best argument?
The best atheist argument?
Yes, the best atheist argument. I'm finding it hard-pushed to think of one, but I will come up with the hardest question I face.
Okay.
And that is, I have every sympathy with my atheist friends who become atheists because of a horrific experience of pain or suffering. And I think that is probably the hardest question I face, but I think it's the hardest question humanity faces.
Now, didn't you argue once that this was one of Charles Darwin's issues, that he had a daughter or a niece that died, and this started him on
well, I argued it, but only because I'd been reading the best biographers of Charles Darwin, who suggest that, and I think there's a lot of mileage in it, that his major problem was not the result of his biological theorems, but a result of the fact that his beloved daughter died. And it's true of so many of my colleagues, and I sympathize with that. So in that sense, it is the best argument, because it has made, in a practical sense, it has caused many of my friends and colleagues to give up belief in God, if they ever had it, or to maintain an atheism without it.
All right, let's get back to those minor things like quantum theory. Lawrence Krauss was in Australia recently.
So I believe.
Cosmologist. And he was very clear that science, which measures items that can be measured, that science is ready to give that answer to the very basic question, where did the universe come from? And he was unequivocal, the answer is nothing. He says that the evidence tells us that the universe came into existence from nothing, and that the universe did assemble itself in space and time. And many countries of the world, to a lesser extent Australia, have contributed to the Large Hadron Collider, which came up with the remarkable scientific discovery of the Higgs boson particle. It does exist, the God particle as it's known. He has a key piece of evidence for that position, doesn't he?
No.
Why not?
Well, it's interesting. Peter Higgs doesn't like the name, the Higgs, the God particle, because it's no such thing. But Lawrence Krauss revealed his confusion, I think, to be quite honest, in an article he wrote to which I replied in our national press. And he said the excitement, there was great and fascinating and wonderful stuff, CERN finding the Higgs boson and Higgs getting the Nobel Prize. But he wrote this: the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. Well, that provoked the Irish in me, I'm afraid. And I replied, well, yes, of course, if you're giving a lecture on particle physics in the university, the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. But if you're giving a lecture on why there is a universe in which particle physics can be done, then God's more important than the Higgs boson. Now, Krauss claims the universe comes from nothing. Now, this has been such a wow factor around the world that I find myself increasingly giving lectures about nothing. It's just such a fascinating topic, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing. You see, I cannot take Lawrence Krauss seriously, and if he was sitting there, I would say so, because I have said so to him. Because he talks nonsense about nothing. Just listen to a quote from about page 4 of his book, A Universe from Nothing. I'm not querying his capacity as an astrophysicist. I enjoyed the rest of his book. But listen to this. Because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. What? Let me repeat it. Because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially as if you define it as the absence of something. Now, the claim of the book, and Stephen Hawking and Mlodinoff's book, The Grand Design, is to get a universe from nothing. Now, this is fascinating to me, because I lived through the time in the 60s when the evidence for the Standard Model, Hot Big Bang, and so on came in. Fiercely resisted, of course, by the scientific establishment of the day, because they thought it supported the Bible, which is rather amusing with hindsight, that the biggest scientific discovery of the 20th century was resisted because the Bible had been saying there was a beginning for millennia. But the interesting thing about it is that physics and cosmology have forced scientists now, or have driven them into the position where they have nothing to start with. That is nothing physical. So they've got to get something from nothing. Now, how do you do that? Well, by redefining nothing. That's how you do it. Because you see...
But they're theorising. That's part of the natural
scientific process. Oh, no, wait a minute.
Process.
No, they're not theorising. They're talking nonsense about nothing. Let me try and explain it. You see, in ordinary language, nothing means the absence of anything. So if I say I went down the street in Brisbane and I met nobody, it doesn't mean I met somebody called nobody. It means I didn't meet anybody, right? So what they do is they cannot get a universe from nothing, not even Krauss. So they redefine nothing to be a quantum vacuum, which is not nothing. And when Krauss published this and Hawking published this, people came down on them like a ton of bricks. Now, I have a great advantage here. Though I'm not a particle physicist and not a cosmologist, I had the opportunity to debate the father of all this stuff, Alan Guth, at the MIT Harvard Faculty Club last year. And Alan Guth is the father of the theory of inflation. And all these people are surrounding him, but he's the real brains behind it. And in public, we had a wonderful public debate on the existence of God. And at the end of it, I said, Alan, I can't resist another question, Out there, among most of us, there's great confusion about nothing. And he sort of grinned, you see. And I said, look, please clear it up for me. When you, as an astrophysicist, talk about nothing, you do not mean nothing in the ordinary, acceptable philosophical sense of absence of anything. He said, we certainly do not. And I said, thank you very much. So Krauss has claimed to get a universe from nothing. He's failed to do it. All he's done is to redefine nothing. But David Albert, who's a brilliant philosopher of physics, read his review
So
of
what are you
Krauss's
accusing
book.
Krauss of some sort of fraud? Forgive me for interrupting,
Well,
but I've got to pick that
no,
up. So,
I'm-
or some sort of,
no,
he's playing a game or a trick of rhetoric? What are you accusing him
I
of?
wouldn't accuse him of fraud. I would accuse him of what he says, that philosophy for him is dead. He doesn't understand logic and argument. I would accuse him of that, as I would Hawking. Now, Hawking, intellectually, he was in my time at Cambridge. He's brilliant. He's light years more brilliant than me. But I think the two of them, to be honest, and I'd tell him that, fulfill what Einstein once said. The scientist is a poor philosopher. I mean, think of Stephen Hawking, who did the same thing. You know that Krauss got into a huge row with the philosophers and had to backtrack. Hawking, in his book, The Grand Design, said he raises the big questions, and I thought this is wonderful to hear a great mind wrestling with the great questions. And then he said, traditionally these questions were questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. And I said, what? And then he said, it is left to scientists to be the torchbearers of truth. And then what does he do? Write a book on the philosophy of science. So that shows me that not even, and I would say this, not even an undergraduate who'd studied philosophy read either of those two books, or they would not have been published in their present position.
In the beginning of your speech before, you used this phrase that I'll summarise as scientific authority. That authority comes from science. He can write the philosophy of science because they can measure things. So when the Large Hadron Collider collides atoms and creates the Higgs, discovers the Higgs boson, there's something to measure and show. So the reason why they can do this, surely, is because they have authority, because they can show the steps and the result. Doesn't that give them some license to start re-examining the old assumptions?
Oh, of course it does, but that's nothing to do with their proposed solution to the God question and getting something for nothing and shoving God to the side. What it seems to me they're proving is that when you reject God, you get yourself into a philosophical mess, which is, for me, more evidence that God exists. It's as simple as that. And I read these books very carefully. Now, don't get me wrong. Hawking's book, the physics side of it, Krauss's book, the physics side of it, I haven't the slightest complaint about that. They're terrific. What I have a complaint about is how they interpret their results. And this business of redefining nothing has become a laughingstock in philosophy and has really dropped the credibility of certain of these people in those areas very significantly.
You accused them before of making a category mistake. They were confusing mechanism with agency. Just restate for me, what do you mean?
Well, what I mean by that is to say, let's take the Henry Ford illustration, which is the easiest one. Henry Ford is the agent, the personal agent that invented the motor car and had the original idea. He's not competing with automobile engineering or the law of internal combustion. In fact, he uses both to make his motor cars because the law and mechanism explanation is completely different from the personal explanation. It's just like if I were to say to you, I raise my arm, and you could give a neurophysiological explanation of that in terms of firing synapses, contraction of muscles, electrochemical interchanges, and all of that. But I could say I raise my arm to scratch my forehead because it's itchy. And those two explanations fall into those two different categories. And therefore, to confuse them or to say that there's only one category is to make a category mistake. That's all I'm suggesting. It's a very simple idea.
Should the theory of evolution lead us to believe in naturalism?
No.
Okay.
Or yes.
Well,
It depends entirely what you mean by evolution. You see, this is another question where definitions are very important. I'm afraid semantics, the more I study science, the more important the arts and concept of language. Now, you phrased it, should the theory of evolution lead us to believe in atheism? Well, certainly not, because if you abstract from what evolution is in the popular mind, let's say, natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, neo-Darwinian synthesis, okay? So here's a mechanism that does something. That's obvious. Look around this room. Selection processes determine the differences in our appearances. Mutation, alas, can determine many genetic things about us. So it does something. Okay, so here's a mechanism that does something. Is that in itself an argument for the non-existence of a creator who designed the mechanism? No. Just as discovering the law of gravity is not an argument against a creator who designed it. Now, people would say, but evolution involves randomness. Well, I used to have a self-winding watch. The random movements of my arm wound up. That's not an argument that this watch wasn't designed. In fact, it's more difficult to design a self-winding watch than an ordinary one. So at the philosophical level, and I emphasize that, it doesn't seem to me you can deduce atheism from Darwinism, and that's why there are many leading scientists around the world who are theists, they're Christian, and they accept, by and large, with various nuances and modifications, Darwinism. But there's a separate question, which is a scientific one, and that is, do the mechanisms, if they are such, of natural selection mutation, bear all the weight that's put on them? And here, I think there's a great deal of fog. Now, I'm not a biologist, but I interact a lot with them. And one of the helpful things I've observed is the origin of life and the theory of evolution have zero to do with one another. And Dawkins has finally admitted that, for the obvious logical reason. Mutation and natural selection, whatever they do, depend on life to get going. So they cannot, by definition, be its explanation. But the blind watchmaker unfortunately confused that completely. And Dawkins claimed that Darwin's mechanism explained the existence of life. He's taken that back, and I admire him for that, in his more recent book, The Greatest Show on Earth. So I don't think you deduce atheism from Darwinism. You can't deduce a worldview from a bit of science, because they don't belong in the same category. But I would say
there is a very big push to do just that.
Oh,
People
yes,
like Sam Harris are arguing that morality, Christian morality, which he's particularly upset about, is a construct of a medieval text of a bloodthirsty and angry God. Yeah. And he and other thinkers, Daniel Dennett, I think as well, are trying to show that you can draw moral imperatives from nature, from biology.
Yes. Well, that's. Let me say one more thing about the other, if you don't mind. Okay. I'm quite happy to drop it, because I've written extensively on evolution. I think one of the problems is, increasingly, amongst top biologists I meet, there is an incipient skepticism about the capacity of Darwinism to bear the weight that's put on it. And a lot of that is coming from the nature of information and the arguments I've used before. But to come to this question, Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, came out just as I was sending my last book, Gunning for God, to the publisher. And I noticed he'd claimed that you could argue morality, that you could solve Hume's problem. Hume's problem that lies behind what you said is the notion that you can get aught from is. And David Hume famously wrote that he'd noticed in text that people would describe a situation and is. The situation is this, is that. And then the language shifted somewhere in mid-sentence, somewhere in mid-paragraph to ought. You ought. And he said you can't go from is to ought. Now, if you are a naturalist, you have to be able to. And Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins used to say, it's interesting, that it seemed very difficult to get any sense of morality, especially absolute morality, without a religious dimension. But Sam Harris has now solved it. And his moral landscape claims to solve it. Well, to cut a long story short, I don't think he solved it at all. He brings in the moral imperative at the start. But it's a very clever fudge, as far as I'm concerned. But if you want to know my analysis of it, you'd have to read what I've tried to write on it. I don't think he solved the is to ought problem at all.
Okay, I want to ask something a bit more personal about you.
Yes,
you spent a fair bit of time in the Soviet Union.
Yes, I did.
The Soviet Union, more than most governments, made a pretty good go at exterminating belief. They had a very systematic method of getting rid of believers and the whole idea of belief. And you were there, I think, in the transition. You've been pre the fall of communism, post the fall of communism. And I think you noticed something that Sam Harris would be, fascinated by. That in the move by the state to kill the idea of God, they actually ended up doing the opposite. Can you just address that a bit?
Well, yes. I mean, it's part of my sort of life history, as you say, that my interest in establishing, is Christianity true or not? I saw, as I said, at Cambridge, the importance of speaking to agnostics and atheists and so on. And that led then, I got a fellowship to study in Germany and got the language, and then discovered suddenly that Germany in those days, that dates me, you see, this is the late 70s, yes, was a lingua franca in the Eastern European world, particularly in East Germany, where the hardest communism was. And I could go there and appear incognito because I could speak the language. And that was fascinating. But then when the wall fell, and I helped knock it down, incidentally, not all of it, a little bit of it, I then started going to Russia. And that was utterly fascinating because when I give a maths seminar, I mean, I'd never met this in my life before. You imagine it happening in Queensland in the maths department, where I give a lecture and people are very polite about my work and so on. And then they say, we have other questions. Like what? Well, we hear you believe in God. Why? And you'd have 2 hours of solid questioning by these leading intellectuals. All they wanted to talk about was why I believed in God. And that was a very interesting time. And of course, I discovered many of their famous mathematicians were believers in God and held on to that with enormous difficulty. But you see, Dostoevsky interests me in connection with Harris, your previous question, and this are oddly enough linked, because Dostoevsky once wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, you probably are well aware, more than I am, that Russians don't write so much philosophy as novels. If they want to talk about war and peace, they write a novel, and so on. So The Brothers Karamazov, where you get the famous statement, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. Yes. You see. Now, many of my Russian friends say Dostoevsky was our prophet. Now, of course, he didn't mean that atheists can't behave morally. Of course they can. My atheist friends can put me to shame morally, because all of us are moral beings made in the image of God from where I sit. What Dostoevsky meant is there's no rational justification for morality. You can't solve Hume's is to ought without introducing God. And I'll never forget an academic in Siberia. I went to Siberia a great deal, fortunately usually on a two-way ticket. He said to me, you know, John, he said, as I look back at our history, we thought we could get rid of God and give a value to human beings, and we found we couldn't. And 100 million of them had to die. Solzhenitsyn analyzes it in exactly the same way. This is not my analysis, it's their analysis. So after the fall of communism, there was a terrific resurgence of interest in God and so on. But then economic reality began to bite. And that initial surge waned a bit. I haven't been now for a few years, so I couldn't measure it much now.
I asked that because one of the ideas coming from evolutionary biology is that belief in God was actually almost like a necessary phase or stage in human evolution. In other words, some evolutionary biologists have argued it actually had quite a functional purpose. It helped the natural order of society in a fairly brutal world. It helped give many tribal groups a way of, interpreting the world. I think this is the argument of Melvin Bragg.
Yes,
it's a body of knowledge in part.
It's a very interesting argument. And if that were true, why aren't the most leading evolutionists promoting faith in God then? If it's a positive result of evolution. Because it's a redundant idea. We've progressed, we've evolved beyond it. We don't need it anymore. Yes, I'm very skeptical about that kind of argument, because the trouble with evolution, you can prove anything and its opposite, you see. And by citing evolution. Now, that's not a quote from me, it's a quote from an atheist who won the Nobel Prize. He said, I'm utterly fed up with evolution being used as a non-theory or as an excuse for having a theory. So most interesting, Robert Laughlin is his name, and he gives the examples. He said, your mess of proteins becomes a chicken, evolution did it. He said that's saying nothing. You see, I mentioned God of the gaps in my lecture, as you'll have noticed. There's another thing that's even more widespread, is evolution of the gaps. How did this happen? Evolution did it. But if you have a mechanism and can't explain it, you're saying exactly nothing. It's an empty phrase. Evolution doesn't do things. So, I'm just skeptical of that kind of argument for the evolution of God or not God. It doesn't settle the truth question. You see, giving that kind of argument, there's a more serious side to this. I get accused all the time, and you can understand this, you see. People say to me, you say that because you're an Irishman. Now, it's interesting to analyze that, because that argument means because you're an Irishman, what you're saying has no meaning. Which means that because I can give you a causal explanation, it empties it of meaning. Now, if you follow that down, if you get a chain of cause and effect, evolutionary or not, to explain something, you're emptying it of meaning. That is a most amusing thing to my mind, that the people that use that kind of argument ought to realize that three fingers are pointing back at them as one finger's pointing at me. It just doesn't work because it bypasses the truth question.
Well, let me pick up on that a bit further.
Yes, please
Both
do.
Sigmund Freud and C.S. Lewis both agreed that the answers to the questions about God have a profound impact about life on Earth, but they saw it in opposite ways. So Freud rejected the idea of what he called the idealised Superman in the sky.
Yes, that's right.
He called it infantile. And he predicted that as people became more educated, they would turn away from such childish notions. So he urged us to face up to the fact that we're alone in the universe. If there is a God, he doesn't make himself known. He never shows up. I've heard, I don't know how many Christians say, Christ is coming back, Christ is coming back, Christ is coming back. He never comes back. Freud was right. We're alone in the universe. Get tough and die.
Well,
that's Freud's argument. It's infantile to want a pie in the sky when you die.
yes, but it's also infantile to reject the idea of God because you're afraid of judgment. And if you reject the idea of God, you in the end, of course, reject ultimate justice. You live in a world without ultimate justice. And actually, that's one of my biggest problems with atheism. The Freudian argument, taken to its extreme, leaves you in a world where not only is God an illusion, but your concepts of right and wrong and your idea of justice is an illusion. I made the point at the beginning that Manfred Lutz in Germany has driven a cart and horses through the Freudian argument. Czesław Miłosz was a Nobel Prize winner of literature in Poland who lived through communism. And he wrote some time ago that atheism is the great opium of the people. It's a brilliant passage, and he had every reason to know. He said atheism is the narcotic, I think he put it this way, that soothes our guilt and takes away our fear of ever having to be held accountable for our lusts, our murders, and so on. It's the great opium of the people. So the point I made in the introduction, I'm going to repeat it because I think it's important, is the Freudian argument cuts both ways.
So he's pinching Marx's critique and Hegel's philosophy of right.
That's exactly right, yes. Okay. So what I'm saying is you can't decide the truth by going that way. You'll have to decide it on other grounds. And so what I'm interested in is not Freud's argument, since it cuts both ways and therefore leads to nothing. What I'm interested in is there positive evidence for belief in God. And in that connection, I would, C.S. Lewis has helped me a great deal in his writings because he is my guide to atheism. I've never been an adult and an atheist, so Lewis was. So he's helped me there. I believe in Christianity, he wrote, as I believe in the sun, not because I see it, but because in its light I see everything else. And you see, at the level of Freud, I don't feel he makes sense of experience. He doesn't make sense of the existence of the desire for justice. And I pointed out to Richard Dawkins that he goes down this road and he ends up in a universe where he says, and I quote, and he's never rescinded this, the universe is exactly as you'd expect it to be. If at the bottom there's no good, there's no evil, there's no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Well, apply that in society. If the young man for Britain who held the head of the journalist, Edmund Foley, in his hand, horrific, I couldn't believe it, is just dancing to the music of his DNA, how can you blame him?
Oh, he's dancing to the music of religion. He has a book, a text, very similar in some ways in the Old Testament to the text you like, and he's drawn his inspiration and justification for a worldview.
Well, I'm glad you said that, not me, because not that it's false, but it's a very dangerous thing to say. The interesting thing, I'm fully with you on that, Steve, but it's a separate question, so let's go on to it. I come from a country that has a reputation for religious violence. And I see absolutely what you're saying. It is a religious text interpreted in a particular way, and it's horrific, and we haven't taken it seriously in the West because we're frightened. Now, from where I sit, that's the exact opposite of Christianity. Now, what do I mean by that? I had a lot of discussion about this with Christopher Hitchens, because he, as you know, was a brilliant war correspondent. And I said to him once privately, and he wouldn't mind, I'm sure he's gone now, bless him, me saying this, but I said, Christopher, you know, you've knocked about the world, you've seen Sikhs cutting the throats of Hindus, cutting the throats of Christians, cutting the throats of Muslims, and so on. And you have this horrific experience of Christianity. I mean, what are you going to say to a young man, Christopher Hitchens, aged about 20, who had to identify the body of his mother who'd committed suicide in a pact with a defrocked priest? That's not guaranteed to impress you with God. Now, in my country, what do I say when people raise your question? I say two things. One, I'm utterly ashamed of what's happened in my country. Utterly. And I'm ashamed of it that an AK-47 or a bomb was ever associated with the name of Christ. Now I'll explain why I'm ashamed, and that's the important thing. Because people that take guns and weapons to defend Christ and his message aren't following him, they're disobeying him. I pointed this out to Christopher. I said, Christopher, what I don't understand about you is why you aren't on the side of Christ. He said, what on earth do you mean? Well, I said, look, his criticisms of exploitative religion and violent religion are the same as yours. Don't you realize that historically, Christ was put on trial in Jerusalem for stirring up political violence? That's exactly your accusation against Christianity. And Christopher, he was exonerated from it. And the reason he was in the famous conversation with Pilate. Pilate said, are you a king? This is what he was worried about. Are you a threat to Rome? Are you a political, violent threat? And Jesus said, well, I am a king, but not in the way you mean. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise, my servants would have been fighting. To this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And then Pilate said, not perhaps cynically, as some people think, what is truth? And he went out and said, Jesus is innocent. Because Pilate could see that the one thing you cannot do with violence or a gun is impose truth. There are pictures on television tonight of hundreds of young people lying prostrate on the ground, converting, and the man standing beside them is holding a gun. That's not Christianity. Other religions must defend themselves here. But I'm going to say very clearly that one of the reasons I'm a Christian is that total repudiation of violence in his interest that Christ stated.
What was Christopher Hitchens' response to that, by the way? Because I think you developed quite a friendship.
Well, I'd love to have had more time with him. I said, are you up for reading through this with me? I'd love to do it. And he said he was, you know. My heart goes out to people that have that kind of negative experience, particularly as young folk.
Who did you prefer talking with? Christopher, the atheist, or Peter, the Anglican?
Yes.
Christopher has passed away, but Peter's still around.
Oh, I enjoyed talking to both of them. You know, they're very different people. And Peter's book, Rage Against God, is well worth reading. You know, he's got this famous passage where he burns his Bible and so on and so forth.
At university, not just anywhere, he actually deliberately did it at university.
I know, and I had dinner with him recently and have chatted to him. And they're just very different people, but that angularity and, you know, the particularity that they both share is just fascinating. They're very bright men.
All right. Your quotation to Christopher about Christ comes from biblical text, the primary document
that's right.
of Christian believers. I wouldn't mind betting that a fair slab of this audience, probably half to 70%, believe that the earth is around 6,000 years old, given their understanding of your book, the Bible. Yet I don't know that any scientists or evolutionary biologists who argue that the world is very, very old indeed, that would even continue on that discussion and say, oh, for goodness sake,
Is that a question?
Yeah, well, my question is, do you believe the Earth is 6,000 years old? Because I bet a fair slab of this audience do, and on the basis of analysis of Scripture. So, what do you believe about the age of the Earth?
Oh, right. Gosh. Okay. Well, maybe you did know that I come from Armagh in Northern Ireland. Do you know who was Archbishop of Armagh?
No.
Archbishop Usher, who wrote a famous letter to the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge saying, "Dear Sir, I have calculated that Adam was born on the 5th of October, 4004 BC at 9 o'clock in the morning. I apologize for being unable to give you any more precise detail." So that's where I come from. I will now answer your question. And this might seem a revolution to some people who, if they do take this young earth view. I take the Bible extremely seriously. That's my position. I do believe, in fact, in its full inspiration and authority.
Do you believe it's a scientific text at all?
No. But I do believe it talks about the same universe as science talks about. In other words, when the Bible says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," it's talking about the same universe that scientists talk about. But it's not, I don't teach algebra from Leviticus, you know. It's not a scientific text in that sense. But let's come to your question, which is, for many people, though not many atheists, an important question because they just say, look, this is absurd. It's because I take the Bible seriously that I reject a young earth. Why? Well, I'm fortunate to count among my friends two of the top professors of Hebrew in the world. So not being a Hebrew scholar, I ask them about the text of Genesis. And they point out to me something very obvious, really, when you think about it. That Genesis 1 starts with, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form," and so on. And then you get a sequence of 6 days. And each of them is introduced with the statement, "And God said," yes? And then closed with, "And there was evening and morning, the first day, second," and so on. Well, the first obvious thing from a literary perspective is that all the days begin with the phrase, "And God said." So that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is not part of that sequence. What is more, the Hebrew language supports that because it has different past tenses. And the first couple of verses are written in a tense that changes when they're over. And my friends simply tell me that tense indicates that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is detached from the sequence of days. Now, here's the irony of it. That's telling me that the Bible has nothing at all to say about the age of the earth, no matter what you believe about the days, because the beginning is detached from it. I think here's an example, you see, of us wanting to protect the Bible, or some people wanting to protect it, by overstating the case. And therefore, mind you, I've got a lot more to say about that. In fact, I've written a book about it, 7 Days That Divide the World, because I meet so many young people in various countries, particularly North America, who are passionate about science, passionate about Scripture and interest in it, but they're told if they don't accept this particular interpretation, they're not Christians at all. My heart goes out to them, because I don't think that is the right way to go if you take Scripture seriously. So I have no problem with the current estimates of the age of the earth whatsoever.
You're a mathematician. You know that in a mathematical calculation, you can't go from one step to the next step without actually making that calculation. Otherwise, the whole thing
unfortunately not
falls apart. Right. So the whole calculation falls apart. Yes. But with the Bible, which you place so much reliance, we don't have that advantage. 44 writers, possibly, 66 books, definitely. The influences, the adjustments down history and down time leave a fair bit of room for doubt. Why do you place so much trust in this text for your entire worldview?
Well, for various reasons. The first is I've always been interested in ancient documents and their historicity. And I remember when I discovered first, I was only about 12, that the literary documentary evidence for the works of Caesar, the Gallic Wars and so on, were tiny compared with the historical documentary evidence for, say, the Gospel of Luke. And then that fascinated me, and I thought this is very interesting to pursue. And through the years, I have studied this, and I think one of the problems is that many people just don't realize how rich the documentary evidence is for establishing the authenticity of Luke. And several people in history, notably Sir William Ramsay, I think it was, set out to disprove the biblical record by taking a gospel like Luke that claims to be history, gives a large number of place names, people names, names of authorities, and so on and so forth. And he traced the journey round the Mediterranean with Paul, and he changed his mind in the middle. He said he couldn't fault Luke. Luke has turned out to be one of the most brilliant ancient historians. And you see, even at the level of ancient history, you have a very distinguished ancient historian here in Australia called Edwin Judge. His book is well worth reading on this score. So I would start at that level. There's strong evidence for the authenticity. Secondly, it's a meta-narrative. It's a huge meta-narrative. It's a library. It's not one. And of course, there are all kinds of influences on writers. That goes without saying. That's true of any writer. But you see, I happen to believe in supernature. I believe there is a God. And therefore, I believe there is a God who has revealed himself and who has carefully chosen certain people to put across an authentic message. Now, of course, I don't expect people picking up the Bible to start by believing that. What I expect them to do is read it as they'd read anything else and ask themselves, does this make sense? And when I discover, for example, in Genesis, in the text that's much despised, when I discover, A, it asserts there was a beginning. It took till 1960s for science to catch up with that statement. That impresses me greatly. Secondly, the Bible says relatively little about the mechanism of creation, but what it does say is phenomenally interesting. It's very simple language. And God said, and God said, and God said. A sequence that stops. That's unpacked in the New Testament. In the beginning was the Word. And I remember talking to one of the world's best-known astrophysicists about this, and he said, I don't understand you, how you believe this primitive book, you see. So I said, it's not so primitive, you know. So he threw me a chalk. I remember it was very dramatic. He threw me a chalk like this, and I managed to catch it. And he said, prove it to me. So I walked over to his blackboard, and I wrote on it, and God said, let there be light. And he roared with laughter, and he said, don't be absurd. Has God got a voice box and lungs like we've got? And I said, don't you be absurd. This is very simple language. But if you like, I'll make it simpler for you. So underneath it I wrote, in the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him. He said, what does that word mean? I said, it's the Greek word logos, from which we get logic, and it means command. It's got a whole spectrum of meanings, including, and I went through them, command, code, information. He stopped me. He said, what did you say? I said, you heard me. I said information. He said, you're not telling me that the Bible has the concept of information, are you? I said, well, what does it look like? I said, in fact...
In the beginning was the bit.
Exactly. Now, that resonates with contemporary science. And he was so excited. He said, does Sir Fred Hoyle know this? And I said, I don't know. Well, he said, we better tell him. And we did, but that's another story. But it's very interesting, you see, that in this information age, here's the ancient book, the Bible, saying very little, but talking about an informational input, and God said. That, to my mind, gives tremendous authenticity to the picture that's beginning to be unfolded. That's just a small example.
I want to ask one more question, and I think this audience will be... Sorry, Glenn, one more question. You're one of probably the only people here that's actually met C.S. Lewis and attended his lectures. I suspect this audience might be intrigued to know what he was like.
Well, he was an Irishman like me. He was,
mad.
A burly chap like me. But my vivid memory of him, Steve, and I can see him yet, we were in a... well, you see, the situation was the maths lecture theatre was down Mill Lane. Mill Lane's famous. You remember Crick and Watson rushing into the pub we discovered the secret of life. That's the place. So The maths lecture room was on one side, the English lecture room on the other side. So when the maths got boring, although I shouldn't say that, I was able to sneak out and go and sit and listen to Lewis. So it's such a vivid memory because it was cold. This is 1962. And the double doors, so it was packed. He was a legend in his lifetime, of course. So every health and safety regulation was broken. They were on the floors, they were in the windowsills. There was just a tiny winding path from the door to the lectern. So Lewis would burst through the door wearing a big thick coat and a big scarf and a big hat. And when he came through the door, he'd start to lecture in brilliant, mellifluous English, word perfect. And as he did so, he'd take his hat off and he'd wind his scarf off and he'd pick his way through the students until by the time he got to the podium and had taken his outer garments off, you'd had 5 minutes of a scintillating lecture and John done. So he'd lecture like that for 50 minutes and then he'd reverse the process. So as he continued lecturing, he'd put on his hat and he'd wind up his scarf and he'd put on his coat, and the last words were delivered as he went outside the door. No Q&A.
John Lennox.
I think, ladies and gentlemen, a large part of the enjoyment for me in particular of this evening has been due to our moderator, Steve Austin.
Yeah.